That was such a wonderful introduction, Bob. You should actually be introducing the keynote because I don't have anything quite that colorful. But before I introduce tonight's keynote, I think I would be remiss if I didn't stop and say a thank you to Dr. Robert Hendershot, who has coordinated this conference now for the second year, has been the spark plug behind it all, the bulldozer behind it all, the shining intellect behind it all. So in all seriousness, please join me in thanking Dr. Robert Hendershot. We are very proud to have him here. And I also want to echo his thank you to the Social Science Department. And I'm asking if anyone in social science, anyone in the department, please stand up for me, would you please? The sociable sciences. Please join me in thanking them for their work. And now for our wonderful keynote speaker. I am honored to introduce tonight our keynote speaker, Dr. Virginia Beard from Hope College. Dr. Beard joined the political science faculty at Hope in 2007 after earning a BA in political science from Calvin College, a master's degree in public policy and administration from Michigan State University, and a PhD in political science also from Michigan State University. During her studies, Dr. Beard particularly focused on issues of international development and African politics. Throughout the course of Dr. Beard's education, she engaged in a number of activities that enriched her understanding of these issues. Some of these included working on affordable housing and micro-lending programs as an AmeriCorps Vista volunteer in Dallas, Texas, working as a researcher at Public Policy Associates in Lansing, and working on the Afrobarometer Survey Research Project, a nationally recognized and commended data set covering the economic and political opinions among citizens across 18 African nations. Dr. Beard's studies and research have taken her to Kenya and Uganda. She has language and experience in both German and Swahili. As a political scientist, Dr. Beard's areas of specialization are comparative politics, focused on Africa, and public policy. Her research interests include, but are not limited to, African political development, democratization, the role of women in politics, again with a focus on Africa, and the interplay between gender and politics. Tonight, Dr. Beard will be presenting on the role of women and civil society in peaceful democratic development in the African context. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Virginia Beard.
Good evening. I want to start first by doing my thanks to Bob and Stacy and to Penny, even though she's not here, for the wonderful planning, and just the conference itself and all the networking and conversations that have happened have been wonderful. So I'm very honored and thrilled to be a part of it. I think I have slides. I'll just start talking, and when they appear, great, and if not, you'll just have to believe I have some fabulous slides to share. So the topic that I'm going to talk about tonight is sort of an intersection of a number of the theoretical issues that I studied: democratization, civil society, gender and politics. And then at the end, I'm going to give some case studies of different groups and organizations that are either focused on women or run by women and have been, I think, important in the process of democratization in Africa. So sort of my goal in this is to do justice to some of these really vast theoretical literatures on issues of democracy and democratic development, and on gender and women in politics, and on civil society, specifically sort of in the understanding that I believe that the pursuit of democracy really is and can be in tandem with the pursuit of peace. Right, and so to kind of back up And please feel free if you have questions or comments to interject throughout. This feels really formal, but I also would like it to be a conversation. So to start, I want to give a little background on how I, in this talk, conceive democracy. I don't have a clicker to advance the slides. Perfect. Okay, so this is the overview of kind of what we're going to walk through this evening. So first, defining democracy and talking about the importance of transitions specifically as regards peace and democratic development. I'm going to try to define civil society, at least for the purpose of this conversation. One of the earlier panelists and I were discussing how it doesn't matter how much research you look at on civil society. I don't think anyone's done a really effective job of capturing exactly what it is. And then talk about the benefits and the positives, especially in relation to development and democracy that civil society organizations have offered, but also some of the downsides, which have unfortunately not been covered as well, but there is some work coming out that's looking at some of the problems of specifically non-governmental organizations as part of the civil society sector. Then we'll talk about gender and why it matters in democracy, and finally, as I mentioned, we'll have some case studies. So with this quote by Woodrow Wilson, who I'm not advocating a support of Woodrow Wilson by using the quote, I just thought it was a good quote, we'll talk about democracy. So what do I mean when I say democracy? I'm drawing from the work of Michael Bratton, who in '97 with Nick Vandewall looked at kind of where were the democratic transitions in democracy in Africa after about 10 years since the agitation for that started. And he discusses democracy as either being seen procedurally or substantively. So by procedural democracy, we mean a modicum of free and fair elections that have a basic open participation. So as our panelist earlier who talked about democracy said, a very minimalist definition versus a substantive definition, which one scholar says is basically defining democracy as everything and the kitchen sink, right? So you're looking not at how democratic is something, but something is either a democracy or not, because if it's a democracy, you have universal suffrage, you have political and civil rights, the way Freedom House conceives of it. And so the definition that a lot of my scholarly work takes is the procedural definition, based on the argument that then you can measure it. If you take a minimalist definition, then you're able to see, is something more or less democratic? As I've continued working, especially in the countries in East Africa that I focus on, my own opinion is that democracy falls somewhere in the middle of sort of taking a substantive view and taking a procedural view, right? Because of wanting to test how democratic something is and the impacts that democracy can have on things like peace. I look at democracies in this conversation as being the free and fair elections, the universal suffrage, and the general participation and avenues for participation in their own governance by citizens, recognizing that there's a spectrum of those that exist. So I really do see, especially in the African context, looking at democracies, that a number of the states are on some kind of trajectory or spectrum of democracy, which I think is important because then looking at these democratic transitions and consolidations in Africa can help us potentially understand democracy globally and what to expect, whether we're studying or practitioners pursuing democracy in other parts of the world. Part of my interest in studying Africa is to hopefully serve as a collaborative with African scholars' voice to bring the story that Africa has to the table of political science and public policy, and not just see sort of Africa as an actor to be acted upon by the rest of the world, but really seeing a value in understanding. And I think democracy best conceived of in the African context is this intersection between procedural and substantive democracy, which is kind of a number of these quotes capture sort of this intersection between what is democracy. In talking about how we define democracy and in the context of a conference on peace, I thought it was important to pay some heed to the democratic peace theory. So part of why democracy matters in talking about peace is this idea and research surrounding whether or not democracies are less likely to go to war. And most of the evidence is that yes, with each other, that is the case. So what we've seen in the last few decades, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is that democracy and the rise of democracy has correlated, at least, if not been causally related with, fewer interstate conflicts, right? And yet, not with fewer intrastate conflicts, civil conflicts, and the thing that are still affecting lots of people's lives. So lack of peace at that level. And I don't talk about it in this presentation, but in my overall research and look at peace and the role of democracy and gender, I look well beyond formal conflict to look at interpersonal relationships, domestic violence, things within communities, et cetera. And I think we've seen a rise in those kinds of conflicts. And so democracy is important, and I think it does correlate to a certain extent with the decrease in interstate conflicts. So the democratic peace theory has validity, and yet I think it's important to try to understand, will increasing levels of democracy and the more substantive sides of democracy correlate with the ability to overcome these internal conflicts and the kinds of conflicts that we see existing in the world. So this is where democracy and peace do relate. And the last point here, transitions versus consolidation. In the case of Africa, as far as democracy and conflict is concerned, taking thesis from a number of comparative political scientists, they've said, well, transitions to democracy involve sort of growing pains. So there's going to be upheaval, especially when you relate it with the often had together transition to democracy and the liberalization of markets. You see the removal of these social safety nets, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be sort of spoils of the war that is to become democracy. But yet this will be temporary, and eventually countries will move through this stage, so a very sort of linear path understanding of democratic development, and eventually we'll see more peace, more sustainable development, etc. Unfortunately, in the African context, we haven't seen many countries move past this sort of short-term growing pain stage. We've seen a lot of reversals in democracy. We've seen countries explode and not necessarily become autocratic or some other form of government, but have really problematic evidence of how democratic they were to begin with, right? So the case of Rwanda, up until April of '94, when the genocide exploded, reports were coming out lauding it as an exemplar of democracy in Africa. I study in Kenya, and arguably the same could have been said for a lot of the work that was being done on Kenya up until the 2007-2008 elections, which if you don't know, resulted in 3 months of brutal bloodshed that did not reach the level of the genocide in Rwanda, but was still extremely horrific and has left the society pretty in upheaval, right? There are still people who can't go home and issues about land that are still really rife. So this idea that transitions are the short term and eventually democracy will consolidate and we'll see peace happen, we haven't seen that in the African context as of yet for the most part. You have some outlier countries such as Ghana or South Africa that haven't had some of these explosive events. But so trying to understand, is this idea that the transitions are short term and we can assume that democratic development will happen and the conflict will go away internally. Given the African story so far, that's not a safe assumption. And I think the study of Africa adds that to the conversation on democracy. And civil society has been an important player in the development of democracies in Africa. Some of the case studies that I'll get to, hopefully without running out of time, talk about the different groups that have been key players both in agitating for democracy, in changing the volition and the ability of elites to not turn towards democracy, have been civil society organizations. And so the first thing I want to do is try to make sure we're all on the same page by what I mean by civil society. So I'm going to read this. In layman's terms, civil society is, quote, the sphere of influence that encompasses residents of a society or across societies in voluntary action and interaction around shared interests, values, purposes, or goals. Importantly, these groups are distinct from the state, family, or markets. In theory, the institutional forms of civil society, also known as non-governmental organizations or NGOs, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, are distinct from the state, from families and markets as well. Though in practice, this clear distinction, somewhat like Woodrow Wilson's distinction between public administration and politics, is not that clear, right? So civil society, which I'll talk about in a little bit, pros and cons. One of the cons is that it's not always this voice of independent accountability, and yet in theory, that's what I conceive of when I think of civil society organizations. And throughout this talk, I'll probably use the term NGO interchangeably with civil society, recognizing that civil society is broader than just NGOs, but my work has focused on NGOs that have been part of democratization and peace-building processes. So one of the things that I want us to look at now is kind of the roles that NGOs have played in democratic development, specifically with an eye towards the African context. First, and this is in general, but my examples are going to be African, civil society organizations offer accountability, right? They're a voice over and against the state. We have groups globally like Human Rights Watch that are calling states out on making sure that they're not practicing human rights abuses and that they're doing what they're supposed to do as a state. In Kenya, where I've done work, a really important organization is the Kenya Land Alliance. Given the recent conflict there that was often couched as an ethnic problem, is really rooted in land and the land policies that go back to colonization and then the decolonization process. The Kenya Land Alliance is an umbrella nonprofit organization working with all the parties that are interested in land. And so they bring together your average citizens, landholders, squatters on land, people with effective as well as real rights or stated rights to land, and decision makers to try to mitigate at a level that doesn't end in violence the issues of land. And so there's sort of the supposedly neutral body. When I was there this past June, I spoke with a woman who had worked with the KLA who said, in theory, they're neutral, but not necessarily in practice, which I will talk about that in a little bit, but it was somewhat disheartening for me to see this group that I really have seen do a lot of good work in trying to work on some of the root conflict issues in Kenya potentially be somewhat co-opted by the state. But secondly, civil society organizations, again, based on the assumption of their independence from the state, after sort of some of the failings of the way development assistance was done in the 70s into the 80s, have been conduits for foreign assistance and have been seen as an important partner, again, with the accountability to the state in doing development assistance. And you can see that through a number of different organizations, whether it's the domestic branch in an African country of World Vision, or whether it's a local NGO, of working with some of the major international financial institutions, as well as groups like USAID and its equivalents around the globe, on being part of the official development enterprise. Thirdly, civil society organizations serve as a vehicle for aggregating the interests of the citizens to the state. And so groups, and I'm going to talk about a few that I've interviewed with, such as the National Council of Churches in Kenya, the Catholic Justice Peace Commission, the National Muslim Council of Kenya. They bring together their citizens not only for some of their stated, in this group, these are faith-based groups, which has been another area I've focused on, but they bring petitions, or they bring the voice of what their members are saying to meetings of the state, and they have the ears of policymakers. So that's been a really important role that they've played. All of the organizations I just mentioned work together in an interfaith collaborative, doing the primary civic education in Kenya before the 2002 transitional election there, as well as before both constitutional referendums. And interestingly, one of the things I found when I was in Kenya this past year, which was 2 months before their successful constitutional referendum, I think the political elites had recognized the important role that the civil society community played in aggregating the interests and in mobilizing people in the 2005 referendum, and during which time the Constitution failed. And it should have. It was a bad Constitution. This time they included some very interesting provisions in the Constitution that divided the faith communities, divided the civil society communities, which are primarily led by faith groups in Kenya. And you saw a lot more really negative public discourse among civil society members that you didn't see in 2005. So it was really concerning for a lot of us on the ground who were studying what could happen in the referendum, because you were hearing language of otherizing along religious lines that you don't hear in Kenya. And I think that had to do with sort of an elite divide and conquer strategy of the civil society community. Luckily, the referendum passed and there was no violence, and they ratified the election pretty quickly. But there was definitely some, I think had the violence not been so recent and fresh in people's mind, it could have easily exploded. And it really seemed that the elites, as well as people on the ground, recognized the important role that the civil society community had played in garnering interests of your average citizen to the state. Lastly, I keep backing away from the microphone. Civil society organizations help develop and do some of the grassroots work, either implicitly or explicitly, that leads to democratic values. So whether they're explicitly political or not, they're bringing people together. People are learning different kinds of community problem-solving skills. Specifically, when I talk about gender in civil society, people are getting education that they might not otherwise get because they haven't had access to formal education. And so civil society organizations and literature have been seen as really important purveyors of democratic values because of either the explicit or implicit learning that happens just in participating, right? So kind of going back to Putnam's Bowling Alone, this idea that the loss of civil society could undermine democratic development. So arguably, civil society is building, as organizations, a more civil society, which is seen as important for developing democracy. So some of what the Afrobarometer survey research looks at are people's political values. And part of what my dissertation project a number of years ago looked at was how are these values being developed and how do they relate to specifically faith-based civic organizations. And I found that across the board, regardless of ideology or content, more active members in either Christian or Muslim groups were more likely to express democratic values, to be positively engaged in what were conceived of as democratic behaviors, and to have a support for democracy and a very critical eye to recognize how good or not their democracy was in their given country. And that was across, at the time, there were 14 countries I looked at, and that was across all 14. And I have some really interesting findings comparing Christians and Muslims that showed Muslims to be more democratic in certain situations, and I would be happy to talk about that outside the context of this talk, since it doesn't really fit the thesis. So what were some, I mentioned that we were going to look at some of the downsides of civil society. So what I've just mentioned have been all the positive ways that NGOs and other civil society organizations have fostered democracy and therefore helped pursue peace. So some of the literature that's finally emerging critiquing civil society and its role in the building of sustainable peace look at a number of critiques. So I'm going to walk through those briefly. First, because of the financial role that civil society has played primarily, as well as their need to be responsive to funders and to state grants, right? So sort of self-interest survival and the need just to have money to do their programs, they can often be co-opted by international or domestic state players, which hurts their ability to serve that accountability role. And it hurts their ability to be truly objective. So in the case of Kenya, the anti-corruption organization was an NGO officially, and yet everything that was coming out was so mild when I was there and following some of their literature on how corrupt the country of Kenya was. I'm not willing to say that all African countries have corrupt leaders, but Kenya is very, very corrupt in its institutions. If you want to get a business there, there's a reason Kenya has declining foreign direct investment. You're going to pay a bribe at every level. From the guy at the airport that you're bringing your personal computer in. I've had experiences where people with me were asked to give the entire price of their personal laptop they were bringing in to do research as a bribe to be allowed to bring it in the country. So there is a lot of corruption at every level, in the country of Kenya, and yet this organization had specific members that were involved that were either spouses, cousins, or community mates of people in the parliament. And so the reports that were coming out were just really sort of critique light of the corruption in Kenya. And so this co-opting by the state is really problematic. Another organization that I'll talk about is one of the case studies, the National Muslim Council of Kenya, sprang out of a woman who was in the position of the women's director for the leading Muslim organization in Kenya, the Supreme Council of Kenyan Muslims, or SUPKEM. And she finally got tired of feeling like that A, she as a woman was a figurehead, and that B, SUPKEM was not an apolitical body offering the voice of Muslims to the state, but they actually were in the pockets of parliament members, and some actually had appointed seats in the parliament. So she left and started a completely different grassroots organization. And so both in the ability to represent the interests of their constituents and to do good work, we've seen a lot of examples of this being hurt by the relationship to funding and the relationship to power brokers in the decision-making arena. Another weakness of civil society that has been critiqued, I'm going to have to read this, is that NGOs too often end up serving their own interest, whether they realize it or not. Oftentimes, the programs on the ground are based on either Western or external assumptions, or based on the needs of the organization. So a book by Maurice Amutabi that I was speaking about with some people at dinner tonight gives the example of the Rockefeller Foundation working with mission schools. This was in Kenya. And that they worked in tandem. This was during the colonial enterprise with the colonial leaders, and that what was being taught in the schools and the kinds of things that the Rockefeller Foundation was willing to fund helped to create mindsets of submissiveness and acceptance of the colonial enterprise, right? And so the NGO, to get the funding that they needed, they participated in this process, the NGO being the groups that were running the mission schools. He concludes this section of talking about this self-interest by saying there are a few cases, and he's looked both at examples during the colonial period and in the decolonization movements and in post-colonial Kenya. There are a few cases where one notices genuine development concern for indigenous people's interests. And yet, this is not, unfortunately, the case in all or even a majority of the samples that I represent. And so, and this is a critique that is starting to be more in the studies of civil society organizations, that NGOs simply need to recognize what their motivations are, what their interests are. And so this is not an entirely separate issue from the critique that they can be co-opted by the funders or by the state. All of these critiques kind of interrelate. And even though NGOs do tend to fit some of the other lauded factors of being more flexible, more creative, closer to the ground and closer to the information, people working for NGOs, especially expats, often have their own cultural lenses that they bring. So even the evaluations they're doing of the needs of the community can be problematic. So for example, I was in Kenya a number of years ago, actually right after the violence, and I was there originally to work on an evaluation project for a community among an indigenous people group, the Pokot. And the reason we went was there was a whole group of people from Holland that had funded a Christian girls' school among the Pokot. And we got word that a new organization had taken over to run the nonprofit, and she came in and said, this is not financially sustainable, parents aren't paying school fees, there's only 40 girls in the school. So she closed the girls' school and folded it into the boys' school. And this had lots of cultural and just overall problems with how it was handled. So we went to do evaluation. I went with a colleague who knows the community quite well. And we had a Kenyan pastor call ahead and speak with the community leaders and really stress that they needed to feel safe and objective to tell us the truth. And that was something we were really concerned wouldn't happen, because to them, we all represented Holland, Michigan, whether we were the ones calling the shots or not. So we went and we met. I sat in on a number of community meetings, and this is a small community, so most of the meetings had the same people: the clinic committee, the church committee, the town agricultural committee. There might be one person different, but each one of those committee meetings lasted an hour or two as each person got a turn to say their piece on it. And what we found had happened is the new nonprofit head had gone into the community and said, we don't think it's financially viable to have a school for only 40 girls, especially because their parents aren't paying school fees. We think it should be one school. What do you think? Well, the community's response was, we think that's a great idea. What they told us was, well, she said that's what she thought was the best idea and she has the money. And if we didn't agree, she would take the money and leave. And we can't educate our children this way without the support from outside. Yes, most of our parents don't pay school fees, especially for the girls, because they don't see the girls as an asset that you educate. So the fact that they, quote, only had 40 girls was actually quite incredible, because these girls were all of the age that had they not been in this school being funded by outside sources, they would have been married. They were 12 or 13 years old, and the Pocots still practice female circumcision. And so these girls were uncircumcised and were getting an education, 40 of them in a community at a Christian school in a community that's less than 1% Christian. So there was a huge dynamic that she completely, and by she, I mean the woman running the nonprofit, overlooked. And so her own interests, her own bias, even in how she framed, and when we talked with her, she was quite defensive and said, but I had a community meeting. I asked them what they wanted, what their perspective was, not taking into account the layers of issues that might affect actually understanding what she was hearing and what she was seeing. And so finally, the last sort of critique about NGOs has to do with their role vis-a-vis the state. A number of studies that are coming out are showing that the presence of civil society, the explosion of civil society that happened, especially, say, at the end of the Cold War, or with the passage of a number of different supportive forms of legislation through the United Nations. So there's been an explosion of these organizations, and they are doing some fabulous relief and development, humanitarian work, civic education, etc., is they've allowed states to hobble along without developing. By taking on the roles of the states, states don't have to take on those roles. And when you have states where some of the leaders are corrupt or are predatory and want to maintain their holds on the resources that the state offers and don't have a self-interest in the state developing, the NGOs have allowed those leaders to stay in place and states to survive. And they've actually, by meeting the needs of people, and in some cases that's extremely important, people are suffering and people are dying, but by keeping things above a crisis level, at times NGOs keep the pressure that would be on states to do better at their jobs from being there. So they've created a disincentive to develop for a number of states in some research that's coming out, especially in the African context. And so now that I've said some very dishearteningly problematic things about civil society, I'll talk about why I still think civil society is important, because I do. I think that there needs to be more self-reflection and more evaluation, both internally and externally. And I think that that is starting to happen, right? Some of the biggest organizations have some of the biggest wakes, both positive and negative. So they're not going to change overnight. And I even think with some of the research that's starting to come out critiquing these organizations, you're not all of a sudden going to see, say, World Vision change overnight. But I do think that there's change that is happening. I worked as a policy evaluator, and I'm working with a couple of small nonprofit organizations as their external evaluator. And they have some staff members that I've talked with who are eager to see sort of the very naked truth about the pros and cons that we can find. And we're working to find not just me, but collaborative scholars who are African who can help critique some of this so that my own lenses and biases don't come into play. So I'm seeing organizations that are recognizing the importance of sort of overcoming the negatives, accentuating the positives in their work. And one of the areas that my own research has shown to be extremely important for the prevalence and the persistence of civil society organizations is in working with women and working on gender issues, specifically in the context of the development of peace and the development of democracy, hand in hand. A couple of examples of women in leadership, and why I have this up here is that unfortunately most formal decision-making bodies are closed to women, either explicitly or implicitly. And yet there are some counterexamples. The president of Liberia is a woman. Rwanda and Sweden, both of their parliaments have around 50% of the membership being women. So thus far, we haven't seen a lot of what's called in the literature of descriptive representation of women in formal decision-making bodies, but we are seeing some. What we don't know yet is if that's going to actually make a difference in the lives of communities, in the lives of women. And I say communities and women because I do think that, including half of the world's population is not just important for that half, but that it's important for all of us. So the next level of studying the importance and the advocacy that's happened since sort of the feminist movements globally is we are starting to see more women in formal decision-making bodies, but will that matter? Who are those women? What do they represent? So to make that more tangible, in the case of Kenya, during the Beijing +10 conference, they had this very formalized process of selecting the women who would represent Kenya's women at the conference. And a couple of weeks before the conference, all those women were sacked, and the wives and sisters and friends of members of parliament and the president were sent instead. And they spent the conference shopping. And so they did not represent the women of Kenya just because they were Kenyan women. And so there needs to be more research as these bodies do open up to women in formal leadership of do they represent women, and do they represent better societies. And so the important role that civil society plays in that is that it does offer both descriptive and substantive representation, substantive being not only women's issues, but issues of peace and issues that affect whole communities. Okay, this slide's a little bit later, so we'll just let you think about that question. So why are civil society organizations important? The two main reasons I think that they're important for women, kind of piggybacking on what I was starting to say, is both they offer a venue for women to participate and for their ideas, their skills, their talents to be aggregated to the state through that aggregative process that civil society organizations play. But they also offer, so they're an alternative venue of participation and power for women while the formal arenas are still closed for the most part. They also offer a training ground. A lot of the literature talks about sort of a breeding ground for building efficacy and overcoming any sense of self-hate or lack of efficacy that women might have depending on their context, depending on their country. They offer educational opportunities for girls and women who've not had formal educational opportunities. There's an organization in Kenya run by a Maasai woman for Maasai girls who've not been educated and who fled their families or were brought out by their moms when it came time for them to be circumcised. And so this nonprofit is offering education to these girls, and it was denied to them in other situations. So the two really important functions of civil society in relation to women are both bringing their voices into the public arena through sort of the back door of non-governmental organizations and offering the training and the efficacy and empowerment that women need to step out into those formal roles when the opportunity presents itself. But in talking about peace and conflict, it's I think useful to question whether or not why we should care if women are in the public arena, right? I've said that there aren't many opportunities for women to be in that arena, and that civil society is important because it brings them into the arena and prepares them to take on that roles when the possibility exists. Which brings us to the part of the conversation in looking at the development of peace, the development of democracy, and the role of gender that asks, are women inherently more peaceful than men, right? And so I teach a whole class on this, and by the end, so I won't go through all of that, it's 8 weeks long. But the ultimate conclusion, of course, is no. And yet I still think it's important that women be part of this conversation, both, so to enter into the nature versus nurture debate, women have experienced conflict, both inter and intrastate conflict, domestic violence, interpersonal conflict in different ways than men because of the way that gender has been constructed in different societies, right? So one of the organizations I'm going to talk about is in southern Sudan, and they work among the southern Sudanese between the Dinka and the Morley on their conflict. And one of the things they found is the women are doing the best peace building. Well, that's not because southern Sudanese women are more peace-loving than men, but they've experienced the conflict in a different way. It's the women who, as these groups are combatants, mostly over resources, right? Ethnicity or race is part of the conversation, but it really has more to do with access to resources. part of the retribution and the conflict is stealing and raping women and murdering children. And so the women came together in a meeting that Reconcile, this nonprofit organization, was helping to facilitate among the men and the leaders in the community. And these women across tribes linked arms, kind of stormed the meeting and said, okay, look, you've been here for days, you're not solving, they weren't agreeing on any kind of peace, any formal peace documents. We're the ones being kidnapped, it's our children being killed, we're the ones being raped, and we're tired of it. And all the ideological and land rights and all of those things, figure it out. And if you don't, we're not going to have sex with you. And then they left. And within a day, they had come to a peace agreement, right? Now, how well that played out, it did not undo all of the issues, but the women were experiencing this in a different way and had a different voice. They were kind of to the point where, okay, it's not just that our land is being taken and all of these things are, we do need the land and we need our cattle to be able to survive, but these are our children being killed. And so they had a different perspective that they brought to the table. In the class, we talk about, I ask the my students to look for examples of counterexamples, right, to the literature on women as mothers and nurturers and therefore more peaceful. And so, jump ahead to the slide I'm thinking about. And I also ask them to look for examples of men who are peacemakers. And these are the two examples on the far right and the far left, Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. And we talk about what inured them with a sense of peace, what experiences that they had, and how this idea of experience of conflict matters for peace. The gentleman in the middle spoke on the panel the first day. That's Joshua Amazechi, and has an organization called Pax Africana that's working at a grassroots level pursuing peace. And he's extremely passionate about peace. And so I have the students consider the fact that it's not something innate to women that makes them more peaceful. Even the mothering instinct, and that's what some of these previous slides are about, can be used for conflict. So these are pictures from a conflict in El Salvador. And the language that was used was sort of, as mothers, your responsibility is to foster your children into this war and to participate yourselves. So the mothering instinct of protecting society, protecting community, was actually part and parcel of the framing of being a combatant. Same thing, this is in Vietnam. While in some ways the females who were combatants, it reinforced traditional gender roles in a number of ways, they also used those traditional gender roles in language about being part of the conflict. And so we talk about the importance of understanding that it's how the issue is framed. It's the nurture and the nature together that affects whether or not men or women will be peace builders, but that women have been important purveyors of peace-building activities, especially through civil society. And I argue it's their experiences and the way that we've constructed gender in societies and what women are left to deal with, right? When they're left in a community to take care of the sick and the elderly and the children, and they're bearing that brunt, they're put into a different role than the men who are off fighting the wars. A couple of other comments that I've taken away in looking at the role of women as peacemakers. The first one is actually a quote by Eve Ensler of the Vagina Monologues. I was at the 10th anniversary of that event, and she was talking with the doctor from the Congo who has a hospital just for women, and he does primarily vaginal reconstruction surgery because of how much rape is used as a tool of war in the DRC conflict. And said, it's important that men be part of this conversation. So while the women are very active against the conflict because of their experiences, they recognize the important role of having men involved because it has to be a community understanding of peace. And the quote she kept using throughout the few days of the conference was, "Women don't rape ourselves. Telling women that rape is bad and shouldn't be part of war is not going to stop rape as a tool of war." Men are affected by the violence against women. The example I gave of the Sudan and the loss of their children, the loss of their wives, represents that. Societies are made up of men and women who are affected by the conflict and violence, and they must work in tandem to overcome that. And even talking about civil society, men are still a lot of the decision makers in formal and informal, governmental and non-governmental organizations. So having women and men at the table together working on peace is extremely important. So thus far, we've covered democracy, civil society, its definitions, pros, cons, and what I think are the possibilities, and the importance of gender and how gender fits into the conversation on peace. So lastly, I'm going to give some examples of civil society organizations that I've either studied formally or had experience with, where I've seen a gendered dimension to their work on peace, whether it's explicit work on peace or work on resources or on democracy, and how I think all of those aggregate to building sustainable, peaceful societies. The first one, couple of organizations are all linked to this one woman who I have a lot of respect for, so I wanted to start with her. Her name is Nazlin Rajput, and she's the woman I mentioned who was the women's representative for SUPChem in Kenya, and left because she got tired of feeling like a figurehead with no real effective representation of women or Muslims in Kenyan society. She's the chairwoman of an organization, the National Council of Women in Kenya. She actually ran for president in 2008. She's the chairwoman of an organization that I actually interviewed for my dissertation project, the National Muslim Council of Kenya, and she's been a participant in the Kenyan branch of the Universal Peace Federation. So she's been a figure representing strong women who are pursuing peace and trying to pursue a dialogue of democracy across different cleavages in the country of Kenya. And she's been quite successful and is pretty much supported across ethnic groups as well as across religious faiths, which is a unique position for her to be in as a Muslim woman in sub-Saharan Africa. The National Council of Women in Kenya, the first organization that Nazlin is a part of, has worked with the Federation of Women Lawyers in Kenya, which is a really active voice advocating for the legal rights of women, both for the implementation of those rights and for the passage of certain laws. So they've worked on things like rape within marriage, inheritance and divorce rights of women, which has been really one of the debated issues over the Constitution because of the role of the Qadi's courts in Kenya. And so FIDA Kenya has been an extremely important organization advocating for sort of the formal institutional rights of women as an NGO. And all of these groups have been extremely important in the constitutional debate in Kenya. And I think the role of constitutions is really important in understanding peace and sustainable development. In this country, we just celebrated Constitution Day, if anyone didn't know that. I know all universities and colleges have to celebrate it, right? Because we get funding for that. But in our school, the focus was, the title of the panel was, "Is it constitutional?" And the conversation, the panelists each talked about the way we use this language. If you smack something as unconstitutional, it's kind of like you've broken a divine law, right? And so that can be problematic, and yet by having a central institution that we hold up that highly, it represents an entrenched sense of rule of law that a number of post-colonial African countries just simply don't have. The constitutions have been tools used by the political elite, sort of rule by law, and they kind of wield them how they want to. So part of the instability surrounds the Constitution in Kenya. So these organizations coming out and doing civic education on the rights of people and the voting process, on what the Constitution actually says, has been really, really important. And the main form of, other than the violence 2 years ago, the main form of conflict in Kenya has been domestic violence. There are laws against rape, there are laws against beating your spouse, etc. They're not enforced well. My other hat of policy or of research is the public policy field, and I tell my students implementation is 90% of any policy. I made the statistic up, of course, but the important part of that is if the low-level bureaucrats, implementers, the security forces, the police, the town chiefs don't enforce it, it might as well not be on the books to a certain extent. It is still a lever to pull for the rights of women, but it's not enforced well. And so it's been civil society organizations that have really been pushing for these kind of formal institutions to either exist or to be properly carried out. One of my favorite organizations I've ever stumbled across, and this was definitely a stumbling across when I got trapped in Nairobi in the rain and there were no buses back and it was dark, and I ended up in a restaurant talking with the gentleman, and when I told him what I was researching, he sent me on this wild goose chase for this organization, and they ended up being my favorite interview for my dissertation 5 years ago. the National Muslim Council of Kenya. This was the organization that Nazlin started when she left SUPKEM. Unfortunately, when I was in the country both times, it was right before constitutional referendum. So I wasn't able to interview Nazlin herself, but I interviewed a couple of her assistants who were very strong women, Muslim women, and they talked about that the center of NMCK was the use of their sacred text, the Quran, but using it in a way that, as they said, was not perverted by political means. And they wanted to stand up for themselves as full participants in Kenyan society, but as Muslim Kenyan women. And that crossed ethnic lines in a really interesting way. Besides sort of the tribalism you hear about in Kenya because of the conflict, there are definite racial divides between the Black Africans and the Indians because of socioeconomic differences. And so I was sitting in a room with Muslim women who were Black African and Indian and Arab who were working together and saw a common goal. And NMCK was a huge part of that. And they actually work with not just Muslim women. They were a voice for the proper protection of women in divorce and inheritance situations. One of the stories the woman I interviewed told me about was they were having an increasing number, this was in 2005, of women coming in from the market looking just absolutely stricken, holding their cell phones. And when they turned their cell phone around, it would say 3 times in a text message, "I divorce you." Well, under the Qadi's courts, for a man to divorce his wife, he has to say, "I divorce you" 3 times in the presence of 2 witnesses. So these women were out doing their chores, whatever, their children, all of their assets were at home, and they were told, "You're not allowed to come home anymore, I've divorced you." And that was being upheld by the Qadi's courts. And NMCK stepped in with the support of a number of leading imams and clerics, males in Kenya, and said, this is not how this law is supposed to work. This is an improper use of the Qadi's courts, and they were advocating for the rights of these women, not to necessarily stay married, but to have access to their children and to their belongings, and to not just be put on the street in the middle of the afternoon, which was literally what was happening to some of these women. The really exciting and kind of fun thing to me about NMCK is that while they were very strong of working with women, and they have a network that spans the entire country of Kenya, even into northern Kenya, where the government says you kind of have to sign out to go up there because they don't project power that far, NMCK can mobilize people in all of the regions of the country. And it's run by women, very outspoken women who believe in modest dress, who do wear head covering and whatever, but have taken a stance in the case of Kenya against fully covering. And yet there were men who would come, very leading, powerful men in the Muslim community, and would sit on the platform behind them at any public speaking they were giving, whether they were talking about the education of women, the lack of child brides, etc., to show their support. And I asked these women, do you mind the fact that you have to have a man supporting you to make it safe? And they said, no, because we want our men to be on board with gender issues. And so they were just a really effective organization, maintaining their own cultural view of what they saw as feminism in the African and Muslim context. The Catholic Justice Peace Commission in Kenya is a branch that of the Catholic Church. So we have the National Council of Churches Kenya, which is an umbrella group for the Protestants, and sort of the counter group, although they get along, is CJPC. And I interviewed them in 2005 and 2010 about the role of gender in their work. And they have some fabulous, they're one of the best organizations. NMCK and CJPC were doing some of the best work on civic education and on the inclusion, education, and empowerment of women. And as I met with this gentleman, and he's handing me all this literature on the Constitution, I wasn't there in 2005 to study the Constitution, but it turned out I had to study the Constitution because that's what everyone wanted to talk about. I asked him finally why in all of their literature and all of the programs they were doing, they had a gendered perspective. And I said to him jokingly, you know, the Catholic Church isn't necessarily known worldwide for its gender sensitivity. How is it that in Kenya, in a country where, you know, I had anecdotal conversations with classmates and whatnot who were Kenyan guys about, you know, that, what do you mean your husband's not allowed to beat you? How does he get you to listen to him? You know, how is it the Catholic Church in this context is doing so well on gender? And his answer was really compelling. He said, well, a couple of years ago, because we believe our mission is driven by God to serve his people, we interviewed our parishioners to find out what were the needs of our parishioners. Well, most of the people who go to church in the world are women. And so the issues of the Catholic Church in Kenya turned out to be the issues of women in Kenya. And so they went with it. And so they were doing what was needed by their parishioners based on their mission. So in this case, being a faith-based organization and how their perspective, their experience was working out really well for women. They were doing much better than the Protestant branch, which I actually don't have a slide for, but that was a whole different conversation based on the individuals in power, and I'm aware of that. But the guy who was running the Democracy Project for NCCK in 2005, we had a nice, long, interesting conversation about how women's empowerment and women's education and ability to vote was going to undermine the family, and you were going to see divorce and women stealing from their husbands and things like that. So I was much more impressed with CJPC, but in both organizations, you see examples of the pros and cons of civil society that I talked about earlier. The final organization that I will mention, because I believe I have like 1 minute left, is Reconcile International, the one I mentioned that was brokering the peace process in southern Sudan, who I met because the parents who were the only expats working in this organization have children at Hope, and we met when I was in Uganda because they didn't have a house in southern Sudan anymore. So it was this really, again, way that research in Africa happens, one of these bizarre connections. And it turns out to me they're an example of a really good civil society organization that is very self-reflective, recognizes the limits of what they're able to do. Most of their staff is either Sudanese or Kenyan. And actually the 2 Americans that were working for them have moved back to the States. So it's entirely an African staff. And they work on civic education and peace building among the Southern Sudanese. And they do so with a long-term understanding. They have people with training in counseling for post-traumatic stress disorder. They have a focus on youth and adults and the role that the conflict has had across generations. And they do lots of different workshops and different kinds of training, and it's all centered on peace building for the long haul, and recognizing that in a couple of communities they might have success, and they might go and work in another community, and there might be another conflict that springs up here, and they go back and they maintain relationships to try to really come to understand and work better with the roots of conflict in these communities. And they've seen that some of their best staff, volunteer staff that they work with in communities and train to be local peace builders, have been women, right? The ones who kind of stick with it and work the hardest at it, the groups that tend to have I don't want to say easier, but more sustained initial and long-term positive outcome of peace building have been the women they worked with. And that was one of the places where I started having a conversation, was in talking with Reconcile about the fact that it wasn't that the women were more peaceful than the men in southern Sudan, but they had experienced the conflict in different ways and were more at a place where they were ready to really work on this in an intentional, relational kind of way. So here I have some pictures at the bottom of some of the different kinds of workshops that they've had and the interaction among the women. And in both cases in the pictures, there are women from across the 2 or 3 main tribes that have been part of the conflict who spend days together. And they do some of what we heard in the earlier panel that happened in the formal TRCs. You see some of this process of forgiveness and healing. And in this case, it's Reconcile is a faith-based organization, and they're funded by the Presbyterian Church of the Sudan, which has been an umbrella group working across denominations and religious affiliations, and has been a huge part in the general comprehensive peace agreements in the Sudan. So you see them praying together and symbolically taking meals together and working on building community from the bottom up in a very relational way. And that's been very important for community development and sort of aggregating up, hopefully, to more formal long-term peace and democratic development in the Sudan. Oh, the final one I will mention is Aqua Clara International, which is a group that's based in both Holland and in Kenya. They have some work in Latin America, but this is a group that I traveled to Kenya with this summer to do evaluation work. And again, they're not focused directly on women, they're focused on clean water access. Right? They recognize that there's sort of 2 main issues surrounding the access to water, whether or not you have any, and whether or not you have clean water. And they work on the clean water side. So they work in communities where they have connections and have been invited that have some kind of water source, but their water source is not good. And they do biosand filtration with locally available materials, and they do trainings. And I was there evaluating some of their return trip to see what kind of relationship is necessary for long-term for biosand filtration to be effective. And one of the things we found is that the people who were going around training local users to use their filters and doing the follow-ups, and who were community development officers who were working with community members who had the filters on overall health and wellness for their families, the most committed, the most reliable were the women, and the most effective. And part of that we found to be because the main responsibility for carrying water and storing it and cleaning it and using it were the women, right? And so it was women working with women, and you know, for whatever reasons, the nurture of the way women work in Kenya is women tend to do the water. And so having women as in leadership roles in Aqua Clara in Kenya was making their work more effective. And arguably, I think we're going to see a number of the conflicts around the world, the civil conflicts, are resource driven, whether it's minerals, whether it's land, whether it's water. And so to me, while this is one small thing and they're actually having really positive development in the Kisii area of Kenya, which there's some interesting studies on land politics there, I think working at different small organizations, working on access to things like clean water can aggregate together to a bigger picture where hopefully we can start to see some of these conflicts mitigated or prevented. So that's the end of my formal remarks. Thank you for your time, and I would love to field any questions.
So questions?
Hi, thank you. I enjoy your talk, Virginia. Thank you very much. You mentioned the literature on the marketization of NGOs and incentives that NGOs have to follow their own interest rather than the interest of the communities they serve. But I think what you mentioned in your talk are the NGOs that are perhaps on the other side, right, that are serving the community rather than their own interest. Why? Why are these NGOs not part of this marketization process? Why aren't they following economic incentives that perhaps other organizations are following? Is there some kind of a set of values that distinguish them? Do they have safe funding, or do they belong to some organizations and networks that enable them to do so? Thanks.
Sure, it's a good question. And actually to do sort of a comprehensive understanding of which NGOs end up being sort of co-opted or ending up responding to market incentives and which ones don't would be really interesting. In the case of the sort of anecdotal ones that I mentioned, Aqua Clara, the two people I work with both have master's degrees in international development and studied, she's from Northern Ireland and studied in South Africa, and he studied in South Africa. And so they're well versed in the pros and cons of NGOs, and so that's one of the things that we constantly talk about. So it's almost like they're very self-reflective, and they're really running the Africa part of Aqua Clara. I mentioned Aqua Clara works in Latin America as well. That branch of the organization is not as effective and is very driven by the funders and the demands of some of the local interest, whether they mean to be or not. And it's not had as much success, right? Because they don't do the follow-up, they don't have the relationships with the communities. So you can even look at that organization as one side being co-opted and one not. And I think it has to do with the two individuals. In that case, it's sort of a random sort of outlier based on the employees. In the case of the National Muslim Council in Kenya and the National Council of Women of Kenya, I think that individual actors make a difference. NMCK doesn't really have a budget. Nazlin's not being paid by them, at least she wasn't 5 years ago when I had those kind of conversations, because she has other jobs and other sources of income. So the work that at least the elites in the organization are doing are not funded by the organization. One of the organizations I'm working with in Holland, and this is something I didn't mention, I think one of the ways that NGOs, as they become aware that this is a danger, can get away from having to be responsive, at least to the current funder, donor-driven kind of model, is through the incorporating of for-profit activities with not-for-profits. So the Holland Rescue Mission, right? They run a thrift store, they run a catering company, and they run an auto mechanics school and a car dealership. And so when the when HUD came out with really formalized rapid rehousing, housing first policy and said, if you want our money, here's how you have to do it, they said, no thanks, we'll figure out other ways. So they're able to be detached from being driven by the funding sources because they have other streams that are for-profit driven. I am sure especially as the economy shrinks and people aren't giving as much individually, foundations have less to give, et cetera, if more NGOs take up this for-profit arm model, I'm sure there'll be critiques and problems with that as well. So I wouldn't say swing all one direction, but I know that that's one of the things I've seen that has kept an NGO from having to respond to the donors quite so much. And that's also why I think, for example, World Vision, even if tomorrow they were to become extremely self-aware among every staff member, their ability to change, even some of the staff members there I talked to just ad hoc when I was in Rwanda for a different reason a couple years ago, they were really aware of these pitfalls and even of how World Vision was doing some of the pitfalls, but they also still had to respond to their donors here. So an important piece I also believe is donor education, whether it's a foundation, so like Melinda and Bill Gates and how they run things. Anecdotally, I heard when I was observing PEPFAR in Uganda that one of the downsides was Melinda Gates kind of thinks that there's certain ways to run organizations, and so maybe education of the foundations, but also of individuals, like anyone in this room. They sort of aggregate the interests of anyone giving to a nonprofit organization, and they feel the need to respond to those. So doing talks and presenting scholarly literature in churches and in other places where you have a critical mass of donors so that they understand not to expect results tomorrow or some of the things that really drive organizations. So I think donor education is an important part of that as well. And Aqua Clara is working in Holland with some of its donors on that issue. So does that get at what you're saying?
Really enjoyed your presentation, thanks. I just got back from, well, not just, I went to Sierra Leone in May, and I'm just wondering if you've run into what we saw there, which was a mentality of just give us the money or just do it for us, which the people I talked to blamed it on the World Bank and just handouts and this sort of handout mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And I met some people on the airplane, and I got their names and numbers, and we talked quite a bit, and I met up with them in Sierra Leone, and they came right out and said, could you please pay for the education of my children?
Mm-hmm.
And then they were very persistent, and they wouldn't take no for an answer, and I didn't quite know how to deal with that. But I was just wondering if you come across that in Uganda and Kenya.
Yes. I mean, even in this past trip, I went back to try to re-interview the organizations I had done in 2005. And the gentleman I ended up being able to meet with at CJPC was younger than I was. And before the conversation was over, he asked for me to sponsor him to come to the U.S. to go to school. But also just in communities, Aqua Clara doesn't give money out. They do training, but you have to commit, you have to pay for the training, and then they leave a certain set of tools, but anything beyond that, the installers and the builders can set up businesses or pay for it out of pocket or whatever. And they run up against a lot, well, are you gonna come build us a well? Are you gonna do, invest in our community? A lot of that's been learned over 50 or 60 years of really poorly done development, where groups or charities that mean well, right? I have my students read To Hell with Good Intentions. It's a really good short article that gets them all riled up. But they mean well, but then they go in and just give stuff away, and you create a sense of, we need this mental block that I'm not a psychologist, but there's research out there about this created sense of the inability to do something without the foreigner coming to help us. Yes. And even in the Pokot area where I went and did research, one of the things we talked about afterwards was this community was passionate. They're not the whole community, these few male leaders, which was so unique in their community about the education of their girls. And they were using language like, we have to educate our women to educate our community and for our future, and things that you don't hear a lot of elderly Kenyan men saying. And yet they said, and so we prayed for 30 years that God would send a missionary to build a school for our women. And one of our questions among ourselves was, well, why didn't they, in 30 years, surely they could have come up with a school for the girls on their own, but that wasn't the mindset under colonization, decolonization. And so you are, as an NGO, going in, even wanting to do the right things and being aware of the pitfalls up against sort of what your counterparts have done or are doing. So I went to Rwanda on this fact-finding trip about potentially taking students there, and the kids I went with meant well, but they took bags full of, soccer balls and used clothing and stuff to give away. And I brought out, I was going to be the very astute first-year professor and handed them all this literature on why this was a bad idea. And I had people asking me, students as well as parents, did I not care about the poor? Did I want them to not have clothes and shoes and the children to not have toys to play with? I said, no, but there are better ways to do this, right? There are nonprofits in Africa with Africans employed making soccer balls. So if you want to give away soccer balls, buy them in the countries and build the economy there, right? Use clothing. Our used clothing has already completely, pretty much decimated the textile industries in a number of African countries because we sell them by the pounds, and then entrepreneurs buy them and they sell them on the streets. So we've already undone the economy in one way. Why not at least buy the clothing in country? And never mind us not buying it, taking the money, working with our connections there that we had a really positive, accountable, trusting relationship with, and let them take the money and buy what they know their parishioners needed, because we were working through churches, and give it out. And this student, and there's a lot of reasons why, but they went ahead and took the stuff, and on our last day working in one community that was all child-headed households, both relative to the genocide and to death by AIDS, they gave out the stuff the last day. And I just watched, and a number of the students picked up on it, some of them didn't. The relationship we'd built just in 3 or 4 days, that was quasi-mutual, as it could be in 3 or 4 days of us coming and being foreigners who clearly flew across an ocean for thousands of dollars to be there. I saw the relationship change, and the expectations and the conversations change just in a few moments. And a number of the students picked up on it. Right, and so you're going against all that's already happened. So yeah, I think that there are NGOs trying to work against that. The local NGO that was working with child-headed households who we were in a community they worked in, I saw them not be very happy with what was happening because they had worked really hard on not doing sort of the giveaway model. So.
Dr. Beard, you'd mentioned, I guess, domestic violence as a form of conflict. Do you see that increasing just because people have been sensitized to consider it? I mean, going back to your example of the Kenyan men that said, how else will I get my wife to listen to me? Is there a greater level of violence, or is it just reported more now because women have been taught through some of these civil society organizations that they shouldn't be treated that way?
Sure, and I actually don't know if it's an issue of actually more prevalence or more reporting. I think it's probably both. I think some of the research I've seen that says it's rising recognizes sort of the links even in sort of the US context or elsewhere, that rising poverty, rising social stress and economic stress on families can lead to rising domestic violence. And you're seeing that with the breakdown of networks as people move to the city to look for work because agriculture is not as productive and so they don't have the other support system. So there's more stress just on the nuclear family that hasn't been there before. And also on, not as much in the Kenyan context, but places like South Africa where the man moves away for 6 months to a year to 2 years at a time to work in the mines or whatever. And when he comes back, the relationship is different and their interaction is different. And so I do think reporting is probably part of the issue, and I do think the economy's gotten worse in Kenya in the 12 years I've been going there, so I think it probably is happening more. That's a good question.
All right, well, I think we'll let Dr. Beard off the hook and say thank you one more time, everyone.
Thank you.
Dr. Virginia
you.
Beard, Hope College. And then just one last word of thanks to our comrade in the social science department, Stacy Herrick.